The farmer's stand. John had owned his farm for over a decade. To him, it wasn't just a piece of land, it was his life's work. Every inch of soil had been nurtured, cultivated, and protected through harsh winters and blistering summers. Every tree on his property had been planted by his own hands, every wooden fence post hammered into the earth with the sweat of his labor. He had spent years transforming what was once barren land into a thriving sanctuary, a place where horses had space to run, crops swayed gently in the summer breeze, and life followed the rhythm of nature, not the chaos of city bureaucracy. It was late afternoon when John first noticed the car. He had been out by the barn, stacking hay bales for the coming season, when a glint of sunlight reflecting off a windshield caught his eye. He straightened up, wiped the sweat from his brow, and narrowed his eyes at the sight of a dark blue SUV parked right in the middle of his freshly tilled soil. The tires had sunk slightly into the soft earth, leaving deep impressions in the carefully plowed rows where he had planned to plant corn in the coming weeks. A frown crept across John's face. This wasn't the first time strangers had mistaken his farm for some kind of public parking lot, but it was the first time someone had parked so blatantly on his field, as if they had every right to be there. He took a deep breath, resisting the urge to immediately let his frustration show. Maybe it was a lost traveler, someone in need of directions. Maybe it was an honest mistake. But as John walked closer, he saw a woman standing next to the vehicle, casually scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered by where she had parked. She was dressed in expensive-looking sunglasses, a tailored beige jacket, and high-heeled boots that were sinking ever so slightly into the soft dirt. She looked out of place, like someone who had wandered too far from the nearest upscale shopping district and somehow ended up in the middle of farm country. John sighed, already sensing that this was going to be one of those conversations. He approached with slow, deliberate steps, making sure she could hear his boots crunching against the gravel before he spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. "This is private property." The woman barely glanced up from her phone before waving a dismissive hand in his direction. Yeah, I know. I'll just be a minute." John's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I don't think you understand. This is my land. You can't park here." Now she looked up, finally taking in the sight of him, his worn jeans, dust-covered boots, the sun-creased lines on his face from years of outdoor labor. She gave him a once-over, her lips curling slightly as if she had just noticed an inconvenience she hadn't planned for. "Oh, come on," she said, exasperation dripping from her voice. "It's just dirt. What's the big deal? I'm visiting my friend down the road, and all the street parking is full. Your field is empty. It's not like I'm hurting anything." John exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay patient. "It's not empty. It's tilled for planting. Your tires are sinking into the soil, and that means I'll have to redo this whole section. Not to mention, it's private property. You wouldn't park on someone's front lawn just because you couldn't find a spot on the street, would you?" The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. "That's different. A front lawn is part of someone's house. This is just a big empty lot. It's not like you're using it right now." John felt a familiar wave of irritation rising in his chest, the same feeling he got when dealing with people who thought farmland was just a meaningless stretch of open space instead of something carefully maintained and worked on. "It doesn't matter if I'm using it or not," he said, his voice now edged with steel. "It's mine, and I'm asking you to move your car." The woman let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking her head like he was being completely unreasonable. "God, people in this town are so uptight. Look, I'll only be here for an hour, okay? Just let it go." John's patience snapped. "No," he said firmly. "Move it now, or I'll have it towed." That got her attention. Her sunglasses slipped slightly down her nose as she gaped at him. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," John replied. For a second, it seemed like she was going to argue more, but then her expression shifted. A slow smirk spread across her lips as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Fine," she said. "Let's see what the cops have to say about this." John folded his arms across his chest, watching as she dramatically dialed 911, her voice suddenly filled with exaggerated distress. "Yes, hello? I'm being threatened by a man who won't let me park on his property. He's acting aggressive and making me feel unsafe." Can you send someone right away? John shook his head in disbelief, chuckling under his breath. Unbelievable, he muttered. The woman turned away, lowering her voice as she continued talking to the dispatcher. John wasn't worried. He knew how this would play out. But what he didn't know was just how much of a scene Laura, because she was undoubtedly a Laura, was about to make when the cops arrived. Laura clutched her phone, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping impatiently as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. Though John couldn't hear the entire conversation, the exaggerated tone of her voice told him everything he needed to know. Her face was twisted into an expression of feigned distress, her free hand gesturing dramatically as if she were recounting some horrifying crime. John stood with his arms crossed, waiting. He had nothing to hide. He wasn't the one trespassing. If anything, Laura was making a fool of herself, and the moment the police arrived, it would become painfully obvious to everyone involved. Laura shot him a triumphant glance, lowering the phone from her ear with a smug smile. "They're sending officers," she announced, as if that were some kind of victory. "Let's see what they have to say about your little no parking rule." John sighed. "Great. I'll wait." Laura narrowed her eyes, clearly expecting him to back down. But John wasn't about to let her walk all over him, and he certainly wasn't going to tolerate someone treating his land like a public parking lot. He leaned against the fence post, tipping his hat back slightly, watching as Laura continued to huff and pace around her car, occasionally glancing down the road as if hoping the police would arrive faster. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the farm. A light breeze rustled through the trees, but the tension in the air remained thick. Laura, growing more impatient, tapped her foot against the dirt, clearly displeased that the officers hadn't arrived within seconds of her call. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. Laura perked up, straightening her posture, her lips curling into a victorious smirk. A black and white sheriff's vehicle pulled up along the dirt road bordering John's property, its tires kicking up dust. Two uniformed deputies stepped out, both men in their 40s with the weary expressions of officers who had seen just about everything. Laura wasted no time. She practically sprinted toward them, her heels awkwardly sinking into the uneven soil, forcing her to awkwardly step out of one and stumble before regaining her balance. But the minor embarrassment didn't slow her down. "Officers, thank God you're here," she gasped, as if she had been fighting for her life. "This man is harassing me. He's threatening to tow my car just because I parked here for a little while. He's being aggressive and scaring me." The two deputies exchanged glances before turning their attention to John. One of them, a taller man with a neatly trimmed mustache, adjusted his belt and sighed. "Sir, is there a reason this woman says you're threatening her?" John shook his head, amused. "Not at all, officer. This is my farm. She parked in the middle of my tilled land without permission. I told her to move. She refused. That's the whole story." The other deputy, a shorter, stockier man, rubbed his temple. "Ma'am," he turned to Laura, "is this his property?" Laura scoffed, as if the question itself was offensive. "I don't see what difference that makes. It's an open field. It's not like he's living on this exact patch of dirt. Why does it matter?" The mustached deputy let out a small chuckle. "Because, ma'am, private property laws exist. If this is his land, then he has the right to tell you to leave." Laura's expression shifted, her confidence faltering for just a moment before she quickly recovered. But he wasn't nice about it. He was rude and aggressive. "I felt unsafe." John snorted. "Yeah, unsafe from what? A farmer asking you to respect his land." Laura's jaw clenched. "See? That attitude right there. He's being hostile." The shorter deputy exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed with the dramatics. "Ma'am, we're not here to play referee in personal disputes. We're here to enforce the law, and the law says that if he wants you off his property, you have to leave." Laura's face turned red, frustration bubbling over. "You don't understand. There's nowhere else to park. The street is completely full. What am I supposed to do?" The mustached deputy shrugged. "Find another place. One that isn't private property." Laura threw her hands in the air. "You're seriously taking his side over a field?" John smiled. "You're acting like I don't work this land. Your tires are sitting right in my freshly tilled soil. I'm going to have to redo all that work. Laura crossed her arms. Oh, please. It's just dirt. What's the big deal? John's patience wore thin. The big deal is that this dirt is how I make a living. I don't come into your house and start rearranging your furniture, do I? The shorter deputy let out a chuckle, but quickly composed himself. Ma'am, you need to move your car? Now. Laura pursed her lips, her eyes darting between John and the officers. She was searching for some kind of loophole, some argument that would magically make her the victim. But the reality was clear. She had no case. Still, Laura wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. She squared her shoulders, taking a deep breath before launching into yet another complaint. I don't think it's fair that some guy gets to claim all this land and then bully people just because they need a place to park. He doesn't even have a sign saying no parking. John nearly laughed. I don't need a sign. Private property means private property. The mustached deputy, growing impatient, placed his hands on his belt. Ma'am, we're not going to have this conversation all day. Either move your car or we'll have to issue a citation. Laura's eyes widened. A citation? For what? For trespassing. Laura's mouth opened and closed, her confidence finally crumbling under the weight of reality. She let out an exasperated sigh before stomping back toward her SUV. Fine, but I'm reporting all of this to the Homeowners Association. The deputies exchanged amused glances. The shorter one smirked. Ma'am, there is no Homeowners Association out here. This is farmland. Laura froze mid-step. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked genuinely stunned. What? This is unincorporated land, John added. There's no homeowners association, no neighborhood rules. Just property laws, which you broke. Laura's face twisted in disbelief. That's ridiculous. The mustached deputy pulled out a notepad. What's ridiculous is that you wasted our time with this nonsense. Now, are you moving your car, or do we need to call a tow truck? Laura's face went from red to white. She hesitated for a long moment before finally muttering under her breath and unlocking her car. But as she climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the wheels spun uselessly in the soft dirt. She was stuck. John shook his head, suppressing a grin. Well, looks like you'll need that tow truck after all. Laura slammed her hands against the steering wheel in frustration, her face contorted with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The SUV's tires continued to spin, kicking up dirt and mud, but the vehicle remained stubbornly lodged in the soft earth. She tried reversing, then accelerating again, but the wheels only dug deeper, sending flecks of soil spraying in every direction. The two deputies watched with a mix of amusement and exhaustion. The shorter officer, who had already been losing patience, sighed and adjusted his belt. Ma'am, you're just making it worse. Laura shot him an exasperated look. No, I'm not. The ground is just uneven. She revved the engine again, but the SUV barely moved. Her frustration boiled over, and she let out an irritated shriek. John, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, watched silently. He had seen this happen before. People from town taking shortcuts through his fields during rainy seasons, only to end up needing a tractor to haul them out. The difference was, most of them admitted their mistake. Laura, on the other hand, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. She flung open the car door, stepping out so abruptly that her heels sank deep into the mud. She yelped and stumbled forward, barely catching herself against the car. Oh, fantastic, she groaned, tugging at her foot, which was now coated in a thick layer of dirt. This is disgusting. John raised an eyebrow. Yeah, that's what happens when you drive onto a farm without thinking. She shot him a glare so sharp it could cut steel. This is your fault. The shorter officer exchanged an incredulous glance with his partner. Ma'am, how exactly is this his fault? Laura threw her arms up. Because he should have told me the ground was unstable. I wouldn't have parked here if I had known my car would get stuck. John finally let out a dry chuckle. Lady, you shouldn't have parked here, period. I told you to move, and you refused. Now you're blaming me for your bad decisions. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she looked ready to argue further. But then, as if a new idea had struck her, she took a deep breath and straightened her jacket. Her voice, which had been shrill moments before, suddenly turned icy and composed. "You know what?" she said slowly, deliberately. "I don't need this. I'll just call AAA and let them handle it." John shrugged. "Be my guest. But you're going to be waiting a while. They don't usually come out here fast, and you're pretty far off the main road." Laura's confident smirk faltered. "What do you mean?" The taller deputy folded his arms. "This is a rural area, ma'am. Tow services don't get out here right away, and most of them prioritize highway calls over private property situations like this." Laura opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. She glanced down at her mud-covered shoe, then back at her trapped SUV. The realization was sinking in. She was stuck, and there was no quick way out of this. John, seeing the moment of hesitation, decided it was time to take control of the situation. "Look," he said, "you've got two options. You can wait here for a tow truck, which might take hours, or you can pay me to pull your car out with my tractor." Laura blinked, staring at him as if he had just spoken another language. "Your tractor?" John nodded. "Yep. I've done it before. I can get you out of there in 10 minutes. But it's not free." Laura let out a bitter laugh. "You're kidding me." "Nope," John said plainly. "You want to get out of here fast? That's your best bet." She crossed her arms, her body rigid with defiance. "That is extortion." John chuckled. "Nah, it's business. You drove onto my land without permission, got yourself stuck, and now you need help. Seems fair that if you want my time and equipment, you compensate me for it." The shorter officer stifled a smirk. "Sounds reasonable to me." Laura's jaw clenched. She was trapped in more ways than one. She could either sit there and stew in her own bad choices for hours or swallow her pride and pay the very man she had been trying to bully. For a few moments, she said nothing. The wind whistled through the fields, carrying the distant sound of cows lowing. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting golden light across the landscape. Laura, who had likely expected to be back in her friend's house sipping wine by now, stood there covered in mud, her car immobilized, with nothing left but an impossible choice. Finally, with a furious exhale, she dug into her designer purse, pulled out her wallet, and yanked out a few bills. "Fine," she snapped, shoving them toward John. "Just get my car out of this damn mud." John glanced at the money, then took it without a word. He whistled toward his barn, and within moments, a massive, weathered green tractor rumbled to life. He climbed onto it, adjusted the gears, and slowly made his way toward her SUV. Laura stood stiffly, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might snap in half. She glared at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The officers stepped back, watching as John expertly maneuvered the tractor, hooking a thick chain onto the frame of Laura's SUV. The sound of the engine roared as the machine slowly but steadily pulled the vehicle free, dragging it out of the mud and back onto solid ground. As soon as the car was clear, Laura stormed over and yanked the door open. "I am never coming back here again," she hissed. John smirked. "That's